Very good morning. It is a pleasure to be invited, and not only a pleasure, but I understand very much a privilege. And thank you very much to Pastor Nathaniel. Sometimes it surprises me when people like Nathaniel invite me to speak because he has heard me before. In any case, I treat it as a real pleasure to stand in a pulpit because the Sabbath is a day that not only is it a day of worship, but particularly standing here, it's a time when, by God's grace, His Holy Spirit will speak from the pulpit. And I just ask that you'd bow your heads for a minute as I ask the Lord to be with us. Father in heaven, Lord, again, you know the needs of each one of us here. Father, I just pray that your Spirit would be here and that you would speak from the pulpit and that you would also speak with each member of the audience here so that, Lord, when we go from this place that we may have gained something that will not only enhance our own lives but will also be useful for enhancing the lives of those around us. In Christ's name, amen. Now, I should acknowledge first of all that this is the weekend for Mother's Day, and I'm not going to specifically talk about mothers, although because it's also related to health, as I mentioned to both the pastor and his wife coming in here this morning, I did once give a sermon on health on Mother's Day about mothers, and normally people say good things about mothers, which is only right, and I come from a family of 8 and my mother was extremely busy. I didn't see her very much. But mothers also are generally, might not always be the case, but generally also responsible for what goes onto the table. In any case, I won't carry on with that sermon today, but I think this is an extremely important question to ask. What was Christ's mission strategy? Now, you're going to see, obviously, this is related to health, so at some point we're going to link it up with health here. But I want you to think what Christ's role was when he came here to earth. And how long was his ministry? Does anybody remember? 3.5 years. Not a long period of time, is it? Did he have much of a room for error? Not much room for making mistake. Let's just run through it a little bit. Christ's overall objective was, he says, I came here, first of all, he says in John 10:10, and maybe it's good to look that up as well as having that on the screen. So, John 10:10. This was Christ's overall objective, the reason why he was here. And in John 10:10, I hope you'll excuse me, I'm reading from the NIV. I've had this Bible ever since, I've had it for over 20 years now, and it has sentimental value and certainly has a lot of underlining in it. But in John 10:10, Christ says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I come that they may have life and have it to the full, or have it more abundantly, as the KJV would have it. So Christ has this objective. He wants to come so that you and I and everybody else out there actually has life more abundantly, life to the full. And that's ultimately what everybody's looking for. Am I correct? All right, so what was his strategy? He had 3.5 years to do it. In 3 years, Christ had to define and implement a strategy that would recruit and enable willing workers of any and varied backgrounds to effectively solve humanity's problems, both individually and corporately, so as groups, and prepare the people of the world to meet their Maker. It's a pretty big task. So he wasn't doing it just for our own little environment. He wasn't doing it just for Penrith or just for Sydney, just for New South Wales, just for Australia. He had to do it had to be applicable for everybody, anywhere in the world, and not only in the 21st century, but for every century beforehand, and if we still continue on, for everyone afterwards. That's a pretty big ask, wouldn't you agree? It means that when he chose a strategy, it had to be one that was pretty good. Now, I'll just give a little admission here at the moment. Ever since the age of 12, I've thought that scientists were the one that had all the answers. So that was where I was going to be. And when I would sit in church and I would listen to the preacher, I got the impression distinctly that God was particularly good at theology, but he probably didn't know an awful lot about science. Now, of course, I've significantly changed that opinion. And particularly in medical research, one of the things that I find is God has actually made this fantastic thing which he calls the human being, as well as everything else. But we've got somebody who is that brilliant that he was able to make you and I wish I could help you appreciate how brilliant that really is. That is extremely brilliant. But here is this brilliant person, this brilliant being, also having a strategy which he says is the best way of communicating his love and salvation to the world. So if we've got somebody like that who's telling us a strategy, should we listen? I suspect we should. All right, so the strategy must be universally applicable and able to be practiced in all successive generations in any culture for at least 2,000 years, and of course it might be a bit longer, it may not. Maintain its relevance to and reflect the essence of the gospel, no matter what the historical time, the education level of the people, or the cultural setting. It is a big task. In short, what strategy would Christ use to show the world the essence of the gospel that, in 1 John 4:8, and you all know the text, it's one of the definitions of God that I like. There's 3 of them, but I won't go through the other 2. God is love. That's the most fundamental. God is love. He is, and what is that word love? It's not what we would, we use love for everything. I love my car, I love my job, whatever. It was agapeo, wasn't it? It is the selfless love, completely selfless. That's what God is. God is completely selfless. So he had to use something that was going to show the people that, and that ultimately the only way for humanity to exist in peace and happiness was to, and this is Matthew 22, 37 to 39, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and your neighbour as yourself. So he had to have a strategy that was going to connect you as his ambassadors with the community, didn't he? And not only just connecting with the community, because I can sell you products and you'll be connected with me, won't you? Because your wallet is going to be open and you'll be giving me money and I'll be thanking you and telling you all sorts of nice things. Christ had to do something that was actually going to connect at a much more fundamental level, at more of an emotional level. All right. So what was Christ's strategy? Actually, let's come to Matthew 10, and we'll just, before I read that out, we'll just get on to Matthew 9 and verses 35, just to give some context to here. So Matthew 9, verses 35, and I'll read 35 through to 38. So Matthew 9, verses 35 through to 38. This is the context. So in Matthew 10:8, we see that Christ is saying, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those that have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Okay, this seems fairly important. What's the context of this? Jesus is saying, and Jesus has been going about doing his ministry now for a couple of years. He has his disciples with him, and he says in Matthew 9, verse 35, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every kind of disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. So Christ, up until this point, had been doing all of the ministering himself. He'd been doing the teaching and he'd been doing the healing. And he had a lot of people that were coming to him. And he had a lot of people interested in what he was saying. But the disciples up until this point had been passive. They had been simply just coming along and observing and then sitting with Christ afterwards and asking some questions, some of them not so bright, but asking a lot of questions, and Christ had been teaching them. It was at this point in Matthew 10 that Christ says, we need to send people into the harvest. He recognized he wasn't going to be doing it all himself, and in fact he recognized he was also not even going to be on earth for much longer. So he gave this commission, and he set the disciples up, and he said, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those that have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Now, of course, he gave it to the 12 disciples at this point. Did he give it to anybody else as well, this commission? In Luke 10, didn't he? Gave it to another 70, another 70 disciples as well. So Christ is saying, this is the way in which I want you to preach the gospel, in which I want you to connect to the community. A healing ministry coupled to the message of salvation through Christ, which is the everlasting gospel. This was Christ's chosen method of mission. Now, I hope that makes you think that this is probably a good one for us to use. It is pretty critical, and it was extremely effective. When you think that a very small band, or very small group of people in the Middle East were able to come up with, or at least able to implement, a strategy which has now gone all around the world, and in fact has affected every continent and certainly every generation since its time. My question to you is, we might look back and say, well, 2,000 years ago that was very effective. They would have had a lot of health problems back then. You go through the Bible and people had all sorts of problems, so Christ could go around helping them. The question is a health ministry, would that be effective for today? You think so? Do you think we have a health problem today? Let's have a look at a couple of facts. Total health expenditure, and I've looked at the current prices. This is from 2008, but total current prices between 95 and 96 compared to 2005 and 2006. And what's really interesting here is that in 95-96, which was a little over a decade ago, we were spending about 39 billion on the overall health budget. Is it any wonder that our federal government wants to take over, because we've more than doubled that now in just a decade, $87 billion. There's an awful lot of money being spent on health and trying to keep people healthy. The sad thing is, it's a combination of two things. One is, I think we are probably getting a little less healthy as a community than we should. And maybe somebody might ask me a question this afternoon, how is that when we're actually living longer? And I'd be really happy to answer that this afternoon. But the point is, we're spending an awful lot more money on keeping people alive. So health certainly seems to be an issue. If we break that down, heart disease, I mean, this is not necessary really to remember in any of it, but cardiovascular disease, heart disease, stroke, 5.9 billion, cancers, 3.8 billion, digestive diseases, 3.1 billion, problems with muscles and the skeletal system, 3.9 billion. Mental disorders, this is one particularly as people get older and over the age of 65, the incidence of things developing particularly like Alzheimer's disease, which makes up about 75% of all dementias, starts to increase exponentially, which is interesting. 4.1 billion, and then respiratory diseases. Many of those lung disorders, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, etc., are as a result of people smoking. We're having that decrease here, but there are also a lot of other things that cause damage to the lungs as well in a big city environment. The point with that is, and showing you that, is that we spend an awful lot of money on it. We do have a big problem of health. I know that's probably not surprised any of you, but maybe some of the numbers should. I hadn't really realised we were spending as much, and certainly hadn't realised it was increasing in expenditure so quickly. But the question of Adventists, I mean, really practically speaking, is there any point in us going out and telling people what we would consider the health message if it doesn't actually work? Would it? Then we're just charlatans. We're in fact fakes. And I don't think God wants any of us, or at least any of his people who claim his name, to be fakes. So it's a good question to ask. Does it make a difference? Does the health message, the way it's been presented to us, actually improve health in a society? Well, how many of you remember the National Geographic article from about 5 years ago? Yeah, so a few people have read it. Very interesting. They looked at three groups, what they considered to be the longest-lived populations in the world. There was the Sardinians, there was the Okinawan, Japanese Okinawans, and there was Californian Adventists. Now, it's interesting that even the longest-lived population out of those three was the Adventists. And what's unique is that in Sardinia, of course, it's an isolated population, which tends to be away from a lot of the stresses in a normal Western culture. The same sort of thing with the Okinawans. It's an island in Japan. It tends to be isolated a little bit. They're still working on farms, quite rural, as was the Sardinians. But the interesting thing with the Adventists is that they're living in California, one of the most highly populated Western-type culture societies in the world, and yet the Adventists were actually the longest lives out of all of them. Now, you won't be able to see that from here, probably, but if you could see Lydia's birthday cake, it's 1893 to 2005. How old is she? 1893 to 2005. She's 112. She's 112. And what's interesting, I was talking to one of the researchers who actually went and she's part of one of their Adventist health studies. And he was saying what's interesting about this particular one is that even for this photo, she was concerned about her looks, so she didn't like the way her hair was, which is why she's put the shroud around her. 112 years old. And there was another one there, some of you will remember it, 101 years old. She was going out helping the oldies. So she was still driving a car, going around to the different old people's homes so she could help the oldies out as they were. And many of these people are, of course, in their 70s and 80s, and she's, over 20 years older than most of them. But the point is, and in fact National Geographic asked the question, what were or what are these people doing right? This is actually one of the ladies. This is the one that was going around to the old people's homes. But Adventists in California, particularly vegetarian Adventists, are probably the longest lived population that has been formally described or studied, and that's from Professor Fraser, who I think he's now Emeritus Professor from Loma Linda, but did a lot of work on these. Men live typically, and this is on average, greater than 6 years longer than the general population, and females typically greater than 9 years longer. And some key things that are pulled out there: reduced risk of developing type 2 diabetes, reduced risk of rheumatoid arthritis, cancers, some of them, bowel particularly, and certainly heart disease. Now, there are a number of papers being written on Adventists and the improvement in lifestyle and that sort of thing. So it's actually, this is a study that we did also. You might think, well, that's okay for the older people. What about the younger ones? Now, one of the concerns that we have with young people these days, and this is a study that we published in 2008, where we were looking at cardiovascular risk factors in adolescence. So whether or not our young people, and this is generally young people, so it's not just Adventists, the adolescent population, is there a risk of them actually getting some of the changes that are producing heart disease, which we see in older people? Are they getting it in young people? It's known that the incidence of type 2 diabetes, many of you would know, has increased. In fact, it used to be that you would see type 2 diabetes only in people over the age of 40. We're seeing it in much younger people now, certainly down to adolescents. And the youngest child so far, I think, in Australia has been around about 8 years of age. But the important thing is that there seems to be a significant decrease in the health of young people. So we did a study and we had a look at here, adolescents consuming predominantly vegetarian foods show significantly better scores on all markers of heart health, including body mass index, waist circumference, their cholesterol, and low-density lipoprotein. The point is there that good health practices, particularly a vegetable-rich diet, makes a difference at any age, and certainly makes a difference at very young. We were surprised to see in this particular group, most of them non-Adventists, or there's a few Adventists in there, that there was a significant changes in terms of risk for heart disease and diabetes, even at that age, and that's 14 to 15-year-olds. A couple of interesting things here. I thought I would just throw these in so you can see again, because remember we're looking at to see whether or not the Adventist health message is making a difference. If it is, then of course now us being the sort of fact generation, we can take that information and go out and practice it. If you compare, and this is just Australia on average, compare it, and we don't have details for Australian Adventists unfortunately. If there are any people with large sums of money that they would, even small sums of money, who would like to give it to research, we're certainly very happy to accept it. But research does take a lot of time, and it's one of the reasons why we don't have as much data here in Australia. But if you have a look at Australia, on average, 75% make it to 65, 18% make it to 85 for the males, and then 86% make it to 65 for females, 38% to 85. That's of the general population. If you look at the Californian Adventists, and particularly the vegetarians, you can see that the number of people surviving to that age is increased in this particular instance by about 14%, and in this instance by more than double what it would be in Australia. I mean, it's making a significant impact. You can say 1 in 2 almost, and 2/3 of the females are making it to the age of 85. And making it to the age of 85 not just in a wheelchair and having to be spoon-fed every morning, but making it healthy. My conclusion from this is, and remember that these people here particularly the old ones. I've given some of these statistics to some colleagues of mine at the university, and they've mentioned, oh, we should be studying the Adventists. And I made the comment to them, well, I think you should be studying the old ones, because if you study the young ones, I'm not sure that there'll be any difference. Am I right? It's sad, but true. And unfortunately, probably the reason for that is more largely not so much that the young ones want to eat unhealthily, but they haven't heard it from their parents. So they've got no idea. And often when I give this, and in fact when I've gone into the schools to do some of this research on the adolescents, it is the young ones that actually make the change. And they ring me up, or their parents particularly ring me up and say, look, they're no longer going to McDonald's. I've been telling them for ages, but now when you've shown them the results, they've turned around and just, gone onto a completely healthier diet. Okay, so the Adventist lifestyle. This is Professor Willett from Harvard School of Public Health, and he published this comment in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Says, comparison of diets and disease rates between Adventists and non-Adventists and prospective cohort studies among the Adventists have contributed greatly to our general understanding of nutrition and health. This is one of the biggest public health research programs in the world. The Adventists are recognised by those who are aware as having something which makes a difference to health. I hope you appreciate that. Now, I'm speaking to people, and people who are sort of, I guess, listening to me from the audience. You're all old enough, generally, to make your own decisions. If you have children, of course, you're making decisions for the children in the family. It's not up to me to say you should do this or you shouldn't do that. It's up to me, and this is my responsibility, to give you the information and to give you the facts. It's your responsibility what you do with it. Is that fair? So in the end, it's your choice whether or not you want to eat healthily or less healthily. It's entirely up to you. But unfortunately, whatever choice you make, or fortunately, the choices you make do have a significant consequence. All right, what are the key SDA health principles, just to remind ourselves? And I know that this is a church which has probably had these in various forms at a number of times, but just very briefly, and remember that the people that we're seeing now who are centenarians, this is all they had, and they operated on faith, didn't they? Pure air, sunlight, didn't have tobacco, coffee, tea, alcohol. They watched their rest, got good exercise, there was a proper diet, generally low-calorie, vegetarian or vegetable-rich, use of water, and trust in God. The question is, are today's Adventists following these health principles? Now, the statistics I'm going to show you here, unfortunately, are from 2001, because we haven't done it again. And we need to do it again, don't we, I think? And we may surprise ourselves even from these. But let's just have a quick look. So in terms of body mass index, and this is just height to weight, so this is just basically saying how much weight you carry compared to how high you are. You can see that over the age of 19, we're looking at around about, that's probably about 18, and that's about 12. So about 30% are overweight here, overweight or obese. And with this one, we've got 30, probably about 33 and 20. So we've got 55. So we've got 20% over the age of 19, and we've got greater than 50% over the age of 30 are overweight or obese. In the Adventist population, incidentally, that's equivalent to what the general public is at the moment, about 50%. So you'll hear some statistics that are slightly different. If you're taking them all together, it is still around about that figure. Some will say up to 60%. Now, alcohol use, I find this one a bit disturbing. If you have a look, particularly in the 19 to 29 age group, this is current use. So I won't worry about the never or tried or past use, just the current use. This is telling me that males and females, more than 1 in 10 of our 19 to 20-year-olds of regular churchgoers are actually using alcohol regularly. I'm concerned. I was away at I went for a Pathfinder hike with my brother last weekend, and this came up in discussion. And it's interesting that in some of our communities, the issue of alcohol is being discussed openly and with a much more permissive attitude. And it concerns me for really 2 reasons. One is its physical impact, but even more important is its spiritual impact. I'll just digress a little bit, and the pastor told me that I can take as long as I like, so he says you're used to that. But all right, I'll try not to be too long. But it's interesting that when you have a look at the way alcohol works, yes, there are a lot of physical damage to it. In fact, the body doesn't metabolize alcohol particularly well. I say this to my students. But it is important to know that it actually affects one of the parts of the brain, it's called the GABAergic system. It actually affects one of the neurotransmitters that shut the brain down. So I don't know whether you're aware, but the brain has things that make it speed up and make it slow down. They've got to be kept in balance. And the emotional system uses different transmitters to what the thinking part of the brain does, which is different to what the motor cortex does, etc. But anyway, these two, and it actually makes the one that causes things to slow down much more activated, so it's much stronger, which is why you end up not thinking so well, particularly in the frontal cortex, so that frontal part of the brain, which is actually where you make your moral decision making. And I tell this to the students, and they all laugh because they know exactly what happens as they go in and have a few wines or beers or whatever it does. And that's why you become disinhibited, and that's why you're not able to make moral decisions. Isn't the moral decision making the one that's connecting you more closely with Christ? I think it's diabolical, to be honest. Anyway, I think there is a significant problem, and that was nearly 10 years ago, so I'd shudder to think now. Tobacco use, as we expect, it should be very low. I mean, everybody knows, as the ad goes, everybody knows this is not good. I don't think there's anybody that's going to tell you that smoking is good for you. So the only reason why they do it is either for image or for, once they become addicted. So we don't need to talk. I don't know that that's, it's bad to see anybody, but I don't think it's on the increase. This one worries me a bit more. Caffeine use. And it looks to be increasing largely in the 11 to 18-year-old population. Of course, this group is now up in here, 10 years later. I know of churches, as you may, where they serve, they've got a coffee machine out in between services so that you can go out and make sure you get your coffee so that you're nice and awake during the sermon. You may not be aware, but the Sufi monks, which is how it really started in some of the countries of the world, they used to drink coffee so that they could stay awake during prayers. Now, that was a few hundred years ago. I don't think we need it as Adventists, do you? I think we can probably stay awake. Although I was giving a talk a couple of weeks ago, and one of the people started to go to sleep was in the talk in the afternoon, which was fairly long. And I pointed it out to the audience, suggested that I might be boring somebody. And one of the other guys says, no, he says, you're not boring them. He says, they're just praying for you. So that's good. If you start to close your eyes, I'll know you're just praying for me. But here we are. This is the Adventist Health Report card. 50% of Adventists are overweight and obese, over the age of 30. Current alcohol use seems to be increasing in the younger population. Use of tobacco may be increasing in the adolescent and younger population, and caffeine use between 45 and 37% across all age groups. We don't have time to talk about caffeine there. But caffeine essentially, and I can explain a little bit more, although I won't specific touch on it unless you ask me, caffeine stimulates what's called the adenosine receptors within the body, which is important for recognising when the cell has run out of energy. So it's a little bit like forcing your car or forcing yourself to work when you actually don't have the capacity to work that fast. So it can't be good for you. I like this quote. This was Jonathan Duffy, who sits on our management committee, and he was former director. He's now the director of ADRA for Australia, but former director of SPD Health in 2007. He made the comment, he says, are we Adventists a people of health, or is it just part of our heritage? It's a really good question to ask. There's no doubt about it that the old people who took the health message, well, they're still going. And in fact, they're helping all of the next generation who didn't take it on so fully, and they're all sort of still helping them out in the old people's homes. Should it be something that we need to be more concerned about? If our health message or our health principles are so effective, and if health ministry is an important part of Christ's mission strategy, then shouldn't we practice it and then go out and preach it? I mean, it's really just coming back to what we talked about earlier. That was Christ's mission strategy, because he knew that when we're worried about somebody's health and we can help people get better and feel better, then of course it connects you to them, doesn't it? And they're interested in what you have to say otherwise. It shows that you're genuine. Incidentally, if you try and tell somebody it but you don't practice it yourself, the problem is that you'll just look like a hypocrite. And I've said this within my own church, that if we don't practice it first, and that's You know, I'm very conscious of not going the kind of fanatical side. I don't run around and say to people, hey, you know, I saw you had such and such, and, you know, that's not my business at all. It's their business, and I don't need to know about it. But I do need to have people motivated, or by God's grace, it would be good if we were all motivated to be healthy. We'll be a much more effective team, wouldn't we? Okay, so we need to practice it, and then, of course, preach it. I don't think it's just a coincidence that if you have a look at the traditional societies, those who are actually the spiritual leaders are also the healers, aren't they? The shamans within communities, etc. It's no coincidence. And the devil has used that very effectively. In fact, with a lot of the alternative and complementary therapies now, it concerns me the influence of what I consider to be a very non-Christian philosophy that pervades a lot of what goes on. And yet people flock to it because they see it as more holistic, they see it as something which is going to engage them. People often, the practitioners will spend more time with them, not just the sort of 10 to 15 minutes maximum that you get from a Western physician. But we need to fill that gap, and I think we are uniquely qualified because of our history to do it. Not because we're any brighter, I think that's an important point to make, but we have been given a more, I think, enlightened approach to it, which we need to practice. A couple of quotes from Ellen White just to finish off. This is from Ministry of Healing. "It is the divine plan that we shall work as the disciples worked. Physical healing is bound up with the gospel commission. In the work of the gospel, teaching and healing are never to be separated." Some years ago, and I get a little bit of flack from people at different times because of what the SAN is doing, and the SAN is doing this and that. I have certain responsibilities, and I have certain conversations that I have with leadership, etc. I don't think we're necessarily doing things brilliantly. I'm certainly very aware of that. And it's my responsibility to make that known and, in fact, do something about it where it is my responsibility. But I have people who say to me, oh, you know, it's gone too far, shouldn't really have it anymore. I disagree. The people that we contact through institutions like the SAN, though it might be, in some people's opinion, limping along in a far cry even from where it could or should be, and I'm making no value judgment as whether it is or it isn't, I have my own opinion, but it does connect with the community in a way which is not possible without having an institution of that status. But I think we can certainly do things a whole lot better. And I look forward to at least making a contribution, if possible, in that way. But there are certainly very good people doing very good things. And this here, I think, is particularly important. As we near the close of time, do you think that we're getting closer to the end of time now? I think we certainly are. And if nothing else, we know logically we've got to be closer than what we were yesterday. But I think we certainly are. And as we near the close of time, Ellen White suggests in 1900 in 6 Testimonies 112 says, "We must rise higher and still higher upon the question of health reform and Christian temperance." If there's a time in which we need to be worried about temperance, in other words, a balanced way of living, not just in eating, but also in sleeping and in the way we work, in the way we exercise, etc., not going to extremes, being balanced, it's now. We must strive continually to educate the people, not only by words, but by our practice. And I think that's extremely important, as I've mentioned already. So precept and practice have a telling influence. As you go, preach the message, the kingdom of God is near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those that have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. I believe that this was Christ's mission strategy. It worked then. He's given it to us. He's given, in fact, all throughout history. And if you have a look through history, you'll realise that actually it was the Christians that started the first real hospitals, etc. So the healing ministry is something that goes along with the compassion of Christ. But we seem to have lost a little bit, or at least the lustre seems to have gone a little bit in the last few years. But we need to be intelligent about the way we do it, recognising that Christ is our only helper. We can't do it on our own. So I leave this with you. Freely you have received, freely give. Thank you.